Members of the Council, guests and friends, on behalf of our Board of Trustees, it's a great pleasure to welcome all of you this evening. None of you have to be told about Washington traffic, and so I won't give you a further description. Well, in any case, our topic tonight, you know, Dr. Anthony is known to many of you from previous presentations here. He's averaged one here every 3 years or so, and we're delighted to have him back. His resume, by the way, is available on the table at the entrance. It's interesting reading for one who wants to see the record of someone who has successfully and intensively dedicated a career to, in a way, making the world a better place. He certainly is an expert on relations in the Middle East. He's founded organizations which lead to cooperation in education, in commerce, and other areas with the Middle East. He's respected within the United States government. He serves on committees at the State Department. He's taught at the defense universities, and he's highly regarded within the Arab world. He's the only American who, since its founding in 1981, has been invited to all of the coordinating the Gulf Cooperation Council's ministerial and heads of state summits, which is a remarkable thing. And he has been knighted by the King of Morocco and received numerous other awards from respectful Arab states. And as I say, his positions that he's held in the United States government continue to be important and emphasize the regard in which he's held. The task tonight before him, of course, you know. I should add perhaps just a comment further. He's published 3 books. He's edited 1. He's written numerous articles. He's a product of the VMI. I was remarking to Mr. Roach earlier that he was introduced by George Collins when George Collins headed T. Rowe Price here. They were classmates at VMI. John, by the way, was president of his class at VMI 4 years in a row and chaired the governing group his senior year at VMI. He received a master's degree from Georgetown University School of Foreign Service with distinction, and his PhD is from the Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, where he taught starting from the time that he was still a student for almost another decade. He's taught at other institutions, the University of Virginia. He's taught at Penn, University of Texas, as I mentioned before, several of the military institutions. So he brings to us a long period of study, participation, and expertise, all of which is held in high regard. To make things easy, there's a copy of his resume, as I said, by the door, and it's wonderful reading. In any case, it's my great pleasure to present to you Dr. John Duke Anthony.
Thank you, Dr. Baird. It's great to be back again, and I don't know exactly what the draw is. It's as though one is enrolled in a university from which there's no possible graduation on this topic, and only on the best of days can one get a murky incomplete, and one is always having to go to night school, stay after school, and summer school. It's also always a pleasure to come to the podium before Dr. Frank Bird. The foundation that I'm privileged to head has grassroots supporters and contributors, activists, and a network all throughout the United States. And it has been a privilege from the beginning to work with some 2/3 of America's nearly 100 World Affairs Councils. And the Baltimore Council on Foreign Affairs is in the top 3 of all of those that we have worked with year in and year out. Your presence here this evening is a tribute not only to your own quest for knowledge and understanding and for cutting-edge information and insight, but to the quality and effectiveness of the management and the staff and the supporters and the contributors that have provided the staying power for this organization. I don't say these things lightly. This is my 50th year of trying to make sense out of the region and, and my country's relationship with it and its relationships with us. Now, in the limited time that we have, I thought it would be of possibly some interest and value to provide a degree of background and context for the discussion period I hope that will ensue, and to stimulate your questions and hopefully provoke you. And I'm aware that these issues that pertain to Arabs and Muslims and Middle Easterners are often on the edge of people's sleeve in terms of their emotions. We're but blocks away from the Holocaust Museum here, which is its own fitting testimony, so that people will not forget the centrality of this particular region, its issues, its topics, its challenges, its aspirations, its needs, its concerns, its interests, its legitimate goals that pertain to everything that that museum represented and strives to have Americans never forget with regard to how this particular region is of importance, not just to people here in Baltimore and not just to people in the eastern part of the United States, but throughout the United States of America and the world beyond. And so I salute and commend those who've taken the initiative, reached into their wallets and their pocketbooks to provide an institution like that, to provide educational programs, projects, events, and activities that might not otherwise be offered to the coming generation of America's specialists in regional and international affairs. Now, as I mentioned, I would go from the general to the medial and to the specific. There are those who talk about the macro and the micro. If I have anything conceptually to offer, it's perhaps that there is a medio that's now the macro or micro that is as relevant and pertinent and as useful a set of lenses or prisms through which to learn as anything at the macro and the micro level. But first at the macro level, when we talk about the Arab countries, the Middle East, and the Islamic world, they are not interchangeable. They're not like Eli Whitney's interchangeable parts. They're not indistinguishable from one another. They are distinguishable from one another. There are 22 Arab countries, for example, 28 Middle Eastern countries, 57 Islamic countries. That's if you're focusing at the state level or the governmental level. If you're talking about in terms of people, per capita issues, we're talking about 1.6 billion, 1.4 billion, 1.5 billion, take your own numbers, of Muslims in the world. People often think that Arabs and Muslims are interchangeable or indistinguishable from one another. Nothing could be further from the truth. Arabs are at the most 1/5 of all of the world's Muslims. They are in the distinct minority, contrary to what might be the image of some people who are generalists and just rely on what the media would suggest. In terms of sectarian issues of Sunni Muslims, Orthodox Muslims, Shia Muslims, the following, I think, is of information of interest and should provide a lens for insight and understanding, if nothing else. For example, for more than the last 14 and a half centuries, the Shia, if one is charitable, rounding them off to the highest percentage of the aggregate, would not be more than 15% of the total. Okay? And I mention that with a pause in my voice because this is one of the keyholes through which we tend to view the peoples of the region. We wouldn't have people view North America through the keyholes of, let's just say, the Hispanics in America, who are 15% of America's inhabitants. We would say that this is wrong, this is false, this is unfair, this would be deliberately misleading as such. So in all of these years, that 15%, and I'm being charitable, some would have it only around 8%, 10%, 12%, but I'll go with the 15% there, have not been able to augment their share of the totality, says something that should be educative and informative and enlightening and illuminating about some of the aspects of the issues here. If we look at it from a point of view of international organizations, the highest organization to which all Muslims in the world belong, at least through their governmental representatives, it is the Organization of Islamic Conference, founded in 1969 over the Arab-Israeli conflict, more specifically over the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, over more specifically the question of Jerusalem within the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. There are 57 Islamic governments, members of that organization. Of the 57, 53 are headed by Sunni leaders and representatives. Only 3 are headed by Shia leaders and representatives, and 1 is from a third sect, Ibadi Muslims in Oman. When I first had the privilege of meeting Dr. Byrd, it had to do with 30 years ago when he was one of a delegation that went to the Sultanate of Oman for a study visit. I believe it was his first empirical educational exposure to that part of the Eastern Arab world on the ground. You've been the beneficiaries of that ever since. So those numbers should say something as well. Now, in terms of resources here, we have a problem with energy issues. Energy as a substance, energy as an issue, energy as a policy, energy as a rallying point, a frame of reference for people's judgments, assessments of politicians, of positions, of actions and attitudes of our government. This is an electrically charged issue. It so happens that we have but 2.5% of all of the planet's known proven hydrocarbon fuels in terms of oil. The particular region that I'm focusing on this evening has 60% of the world's known proven resources. If you want to understand how grave the implications of just this aspect of looking at the region of where we stand, where we stood, and where we're headed, ponder the following. In the 1990s, it was useful to compare the United States and Saudi Arabia in terms of energy production. Both countries, most days, produce something around 7.5 million barrels a day of oil. But for the United States to get its 7.5 million barrels a day, it came from 650,000 wells, each one driven by a pump, which was an additional energy cost. Saudi Arabia got its 7.5 million barrels a day from fewer than 900 wells, none of which driven by a pump. All of theirs comes out of the ground through pressure from beneath. And when they find it, which is frequently, their challenge is to keep it in the ground. When we find it, which is seldom, ours is to get it out of the ground. There. The average production of a Saudi Arabian well, a Kuwaiti well, an Abu Dhabi well is 12,000 barrels a day. The average production of an American well is 14 barrels a day, okay? It costs but $1, maybe $1.50 in some places where they haven't got their act quite yet together to produce a barrel of oil, 42 gallons in a barrel of oil. And the price hovering around $100 a barrel for the last 7 years gives you an idea of the economics of this and where we are positioned vis-a-vis those geological realities. Nothing in that has anything to do with politics. This is a geological reality that has its own implication and that has stubborn facts with those implications for America's positions and policies towards the region. In terms of the traditional ways of thinking about power and position and privilege with regard to the rest of the world, I'm of an age, I'm young enough or old enough to remember being schooled where it was drilled in that the key factors are land, labor, and capital. But in terms of international powers definition, it had to do with the country's population, its size, its gross domestic product in terms of the economic prowess of that particular country, and the degree to which that country's government spent money on military issues to defend itself, to project power and to protect its own national interest. And nowadays, those are still useful prisms, lenses, frames of reference for knowledge and understanding, but there are additional ones because those are no longer sufficient or efficient. One would throw in now technology. We'll come back to that. One would throw in now government revenues. We'll come back to that. One would throw in now the amount of monies or percentages of people's wealth and material well-being devoted to research and development, to science and technology. One would have to make reference to one's human resources, the number of people who have been educated and prepared to deal effectively, responsibly, representationally, successfully with the issues of the day. And so in this particular region, we have some good news going for us, but I'll come to that at the end. First, I'll touch on some of the negative aspects of this. We talk about this region in terms of two kinds of oil, turmoil, and that other kind. We can talk about both of those this evening because they're relevant here. We're talking about images and self-images of philanthropy, of charity, of humanitarian, of kindness, of reaching out to share, in the best of circumstances in terms of ideals and justice and passion and compassion anonymously with the less fortunate of the world. We are undoubtedly the world's most robust and dynamic economy. Even the one that's like Avis on the inside lane is behind us by multiples in the sense that we are far ahead of China, our nearest close rival. For example, if we have $14–15 trillion in GDP each year, China would be lucky if it's down around $8 or $9 trillion. So we have no near competitor on that particular front. But in terms of foreign economic assistance, many Americans were polled about 10 years ago, what do you think it is that we give to other people of our largesse? And many people with PhDs, albeit, said 15, 20%, 20, 25%. It is 0.1% of our federal budget, okay? And so we are not way up there, despite the fact in our self-estimation no one is more generous than we are. But these are the numbers, okay? And then if you look at it in terms of charity per capita, of the top 17 countries, we're 17th, okay? For each year that figures have been collected since 1954, Kuwait has every year been #1 in two categories. #1 as a percentage of their gross national product, what they produce in terms of revenue that they share with the less fortunate. They are #1 each and every year since 1954. And also in terms of charity per capita, they're also #1 each and every year. On that scale, we're 17th of the top 17, for which figures have been kept there. With regard to international organizations, this region must be laced with countries, certainly on the Arab side, that are members of a dozen to 15 organizations that America is not a member of, and yet we're exposed in terms of our needs, our concerns, our interests, our aspirations, our legitimate goals and objectives there. And so we're exposed and hoping that our friends, our partners, our working allies will carry water for us. But you can ask, why should they? Why would they? In terms of our also being seen as the one country in the region that has anti-Americanism, from Morocco to Muscat. That's west to east on your map there. In fact, the whole region doesn't even get on this map here. A few maps do show the whole region there. Or that's from east to west, north to south, Baghdad to Berbera. Or if you're into going angularity directions, from Algiers to Aden, and Alexandria and Aleppo in between. In terms of that particular aspect of looking at the region, we are seen from one end to the region as the #1 country that has policies that are reviled. Even in countries that are friendly to us, whose governments return all of our phone calls there, and who are part of the usness in international affairs, Jordan and Morocco, for example. Something is wrong with that picture if that is consistently the findings of the Gallup poll and the Zogbig polls and the Esposito polls and the Pew Charitable Trust polls. One scientific survey after the other puts America in the lower 10 percentile in terms of people thinking positively, not about America as a country. That's not the issue. Not about Americans as people. That's not the issue, but about America's policies. We are seen as the Olympic champion of anti-democratic forces in the world's largest, most relevant, globally focused international organization, the United Nations Security Council. Up until 1972, we never once used the veto. Since then, we have used it 75 times. We have used it more than 45 times to thwart what otherwise would have been a 15-0 vote. Use it's 14-1, and we are the veto, thwarting the democratic will, the peaceful democratic will of the other 14 members of the Security Council. Of the 75 times we've cast that veto, 45 times have been to protect a small state at the eastern end of the Mediterranean that is stood in more blatant and patent violation of the United Nations Charter, international law, and United Nations Security Council resolutions than any other single country on the planet. And if that didn't seem like a typographical error, other things do. That we continue to provide a degree of financial subsidies and subsistence and economic assistance to a country that, by the standard of most other countries in the world, is well off. In other words, the per capita income of this small country at the eastern end of the Mediterranean is the same as that of Great Britain, which receives not a penny from the United States. And the same country is the #1 country in violation of America's laws on stealing America's classified information, including from companies within a 50-mile radius of Baltimore here. We're talking about the Lockheed Martins, the Raytheons, the Northrop Grummons, and the like. No other American ally that receives contributions from the American taxpayer is known to be in such grave and gross violation of America's laws having to do with theft and our national security secrets. This is tough going for some of us who wear patriotism on our sleeve and who go to work each day trying to promote and project the best in America's national interest, and to tout the values of transparency and of democracy and of accountability, and to have other people throw back in our face Where is the transparency? Where is the accountability? Where is the democracy when people like Dr. Anthony cite these statistics that are not his statistics but are there for anyone and everyone to see there? We're talking about a situation where there is indeed bad news for the United States. That is to say, the two major terrorists, the 1993 World Trade Tower bombing and the 2001, both of them explained that the primary motivation for what they did had to do with America's policies towards the Eastern Mediterranean. For others since then, having to do with the strengthening and expanding of Al-Qaeda and its extremist offshoots, the same frame of reference has been given, but added to in terms of Iraq, where the phrase in the region is that America killed a country. And it's hard to conclude otherwise, to think that Iraq can be reconstituted to what it was is somewhat in the realm of wishful thinking there. And having to do with an American invasion of a country that had not attacked the United States, that was no threat to the United States, and that the American people were fed a bucketful of declaratory statements that under the microscope proved to be untrue. I'm old enough or young enough to recall having said it on many a meeting where never once was the issue that of democratizing the region, of reconfiguring its governments in terms of it being reasonable echoes or mirror-like images of that which we have in terms of our own self-image. The real issues, the real drivers were something else, largely avoided by the mainstream American media, which we can talk about because in the region it is talked about. And while we continue to focus on the need to democratize the region in terms of civil society, in terms of human rights, in terms of civil rights, in terms of a whole host of other issues, and this takes up more space in our printed literature than any other topic. I can say that in my exposure, in my experience, and this, I've been to the region maybe 300 times. This is my 50th year of trying to make sense out of the region. Those issues are no higher than number 5 on the pressing issues of the peoples of the region, whether rich or poor, big or small, new or old, or something in between on all 3 of those standards of description and measurement there. The major issues, the 4 top issues from one end of the region to the other are issues of war and peace. A number of these countries are dancing with death. They are on death's doorstep there. And they have no assured means of being able to deter their adversaries, those who are adversarially inclined to what they seek to achieve or what they represented. And at the personal human level, the desire for the need, not the desire, the basic need, the demand, the expectation that any government worth its salt would at least provide the minimum of personal security. Otherwise, one has to leave home packing heat and looking over one shoulder. We cannot relate to this because it's not been the experience perhaps of anyone in this room unless she or he is a relatively recent immigrant from a country that had security but lost it. And thirdly is the issue of stability. Without stability, how can you plan? How can you predict? How can you anticipate? How can you prepare? How can you be effective? How can you look at yourself or your children or anyone else and say that you're doing the right thing at the right time in the right way for the right reasons and the right results? These are the 3 issues, and the 4th one has to do with people's material well-being, their standard of living, their cost of living, the basic needs of shelter, of jobs, of employment, of access to affordable housing. I would venture that no one in this audience fits that particular description where these things are absent there. We have some in the nation's capital this evening, some 13,000 people who are homeless. Tonight in New York City, there are 40,000 who are homeless, 20,000 of whom are children. And take those figures and put them beside Atlanta and St. Louis and Miami and Houston and Dallas and St. Louis and Minneapolis and Chicago and San Diego and Los Angeles and Seattle and Portland and San Francisco, and you see what I'm talking about here. Or just take 270,000 American veterans who are homeless, where arguably there should not be a single one who's homeless. So we don't hear about these things very often, or we don't read about them to the degree that we do. We tend to pass them over and go on to another subject as such. With regard to the takeaway phrases or words that I would leave you with, there are two that would explain the topsy-turvy, accelerated, exaggerated, accentuated turmoil since the end of 2010 and for the most part nonstop in 7 countries since 2011. One would be technology. That is to say, if we can suspend judgment for a moment and try to project ourselves psychologically into the shoes, soul situations of people who are quite different, profoundly different from ourselves, and who are without employment. They're jobless. And every day they look in the mirror, to the degree they look in the mirror at all, because many have given up hope completely, to wonder whether this day's interview is going to make a difference, or whether this resume is going to be answered, or this application form that was filled out with all the I's dotted and the T's crossed is going to result in the request for an interview. This kind of hopelessness, of despair, of despondency there. I'm not sure any of us can really relate to this at the drop of a hat here, but we have to make the effort to try. To think that, look, there's no one who really gives a damn about my need, and my need is a legitimate one. No one cares about my concerns. No one gives a damn about my interests. No one gives a damn about my aspirations. No one will lift a finger to help me pursue my goals, and all of which is legitimate. Nothing about it is illegitimate. Now, if one is of that persuasion and of that view, given what I just put my finger on, one word, technology, let's just say that we're accurately describing all of the people in this room. And let's just say that each of us, on average, has 10 friends, acquaintances, people, neighbors, buddies, acquaintances, colleagues, loved ones, relatives, what have you. Within 45 minutes, we can get some 3,000 people right in front of the municipality of Baltimore. That's how easy it is. And we'd all be angry as could be. We're shaking our fist, the veins and arteries in our neck are throbbing. We've had enough of it, we really have. And this is the case for Tunisia, for Libya, for Egypt, for Yemen, for Syria, for Iraq, for Bahrain, for Jordan, okay? We can see the whole region this way. And the media tends to focus on those, but not the others. But you wouldn't be able to say this so readily about Kuwait, about Qatar, about Saudi Arabia, about the Emirates, about Oman, etc. And there's a reason for this, and we can discuss this in the Q&A. So the technology makes it possible, and it's the first time ever that that has happened. You've had angry, despondent people despairing since time immemorial. This is the first time I know in recorded human history where large numbers of people, almost anybody, can do something about it. And the powers that be are at a loss as to how to counter it, how to stop it, how to avoid it, how to prevent it. had to defeat it there. So this is part of the region-wide challenge as such in terms of ups and downs. And the second word to take away from this is a word that's not part of my vocabulary, but when I read about it, I know what it is, and it has to do with the phrase wannabe. Okay? When I went to undergraduate school, Dr. Baird was kind enough to make reference to the fact that I was elected president of my class all 4 years. I got tired of it, frankly, because I never ran there, and I even demanded that there be secret ballots, et cetera, and still won. But in my class, there were 42 individuals, 42 classmates who had been president of their senior class in their high schools or their student body. I'd never been any of those things there. And so of those 42 that an upstart won the election, that bothered a bunch of them. You could see it in their eyes. It was palpable, the body language, the chemistry for all 4 years there. And they would have given anything to trade places, to be what I was privileged to be. Now, to the degree that that's a human phenomenon, think of all of these countries and all of the people in the secondary schools in those countries who had class offices. They do. In each and every one of these countries, they have student body elections as such. But you can have only one head of state, only one prime minister, only one foreign minister. Combined with the technology and the sheer desire, lets us have a chance. We only live but once. Now I'm 40, now I'm 50, now I'm 70, now I'm 80. Time is running out. Now is my chance. And so there's this dynamic going on. And we are lulled into thinking, well, anybody is better than the ones who are there. And so we have a knee-jerk tendency to support the dissidents, the demonstrators, the protesters, the rebels, the guerrillas, the insurgents, whatever words you want to put on them there, without realizing that this is what's at play. These are wannabes in many cases, and they have the technology, and they have the legitimacy of their grievances. This is a toxic, combustible mixture that is a challenge for one regime after another, from one end of the region after the other. That it has not happened in the case of Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the Emirates, and Oman yet is explainable by those governments, those societies having largely the means to address those needs of homelessness, of joblessness, of the absence of dignity, the absence of meaningful engagement, involvement, or participation in their societies. How much longer they'll have the means, who can say? But I think for quite a long period of time, given their resources, given the world's needs. And so I mentioned a little bit about the negative side of how we're perceived in the region, and how so many continue to see as the single oldest, single biggest, single most pervasive issue that's haunting and daunting, that constitutes America's Achilles heel, being the unresolved Israeli-Palestinian issue, is something to consider and to ponder in terms of its implications. It hurts us, hurts us, hurts us, hurts us. It also arguably hurts the Israelis and hurts Jews and hurts Christian evangelicals who are supportive of Israel, who are not Israelis and who are not Jews. It hurts Americans, it hurts Palestinians, it hurts Arabs. I would argue it hurts the entire world. And this issue has gone on in the eyes of just about everyone in the world, except Americans, except the right-wing government of the Israeli Likudniks there. And these are the only two exceptions. We cannot say we have been lobbied by our European friends, by our Asian friends, by our Latin American or African friends, or even adversaries to have the policies that we have. So this is not something we cannot blame on others. This is a self-inflicted wound here, there. It's one thing to shoot oneself in one's foot, but on the altar, what does one have to reload faster than anybody else? And so this region will continue to remain relevant and remain important and remain something of more than just academic, scholarly, intellectual interest. It's in the DNA, I think, of most of our bones. This region is the cornerstone and the intersection of three continents, Africa, Asia, and Europe. No other part of the world is. It's thereby constituted some days as the traffic jam of the devout. It's the cradle of culture, as Westerners know, the origins of culture. It's the crucible of civilizations, as Westerners know the crucible of civilizations there. It's the birthplace of the world's three monotheistic faiths of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. There, it's the epicenter of prayer and pilgrimage, of faith and spiritual devotion for fully 1/4 of humanity there. And in spite of all of the tension and all of the implied negative consequences of our policies and positions, and our failure to act in a statesman-like way, regardless of whether it's Republican or Democratic, one administration after the other, we still have going for us the following: that we are seen as #1 and necessary in terms of research and development. No country comes remotely close to putting as much money into research and development that is not confined to the benefit of Americans, but to the world as a whole, and to the beneficiaries of science and technology, and the patents that go with these breakthroughs to which others are beholden to respect and abide by. No country has as many people lining up for visas to apply to its educational institutions. We have some 2,800 universities from one part of America to the other. We have an alumnus in 800 of those 2,800 there. No country comes remotely close to the military research and development and prowess and ability to be credible with regard to protecting others who are threatened, who are intimidated, who stand otherwise to be attacked by their larger, more avaricious neighbors there. And no country is seen as having, by and large, a fair record of decency in terms of fair play. We have specific legislation that prevents us from getting into the kinds of corrupt sales for military hardware and other goods and services that, say, is the case in France or Great Britain or Russia or China as such. And so we still represent the greatest hope and promise and potential and probability for the overwhelming majority of the peoples in the region, except for the policies. There is no anti-Finland in the world. There is no anti-Estonia, anti-Lithuania, anti-Denmark in the world. That there is anti-Americanism from one end of the region to the other exists, and it really is our own fault. Now, I've given you a broad brushstroke. Why don't I stop here? I've given you negatives, I've given you positives there, and you can have at me. I don't have any ego hang up on any of these things. There's a degree of masochism, so go ahead. I'd like, if I could, to try to take maybe 3 questions at a time in order to allow more questions to be asked and to provide an objective discipline to my tongue in response. Yes, in the back, far back, sir. let me take those three, and then maybe they will generate, in the absence of others, some more questions there. How might I change American policy? As follows, but admittedly I'm stating the ideal, stating a dream, stating a vision, but realities can and often do ensue from the prefatory dreams and then the visions and then the implementations there. The President of the United States, in his role as Commander-in-Chief, and looking out to defend the United States of America and protect the legitimate interest of the American people, could start, as of tomorrow morning, saying, I hereby declare an immediate suspension of all American economic assistance to the protagonist of this largest unresolved conflict that constitutes an ongoing burden to the people of Israel, to be relieved of their occupation, to be relieved of the wishes for territorial further expansion, to allow the Palestinians to become citizens for the first time again since World War II, and to relieve the American people of a burden that is unconscionable and that ought not, by any frame of reference or standard of argumentation, to be allowed to continue indefinitely. And that people would say, well, my gosh, you can't do that. Well, of course he can do it. And people would say, well, it would be against the law. Well, we're seen as the Olympic champion of law violations on this issue up to this point, okay? And others would say, well, that's an impeachable offense. Let it be an impeachable offense, okay? Let the head of state of the world's most powerful country that has been involved in this issue up to its ears and beyond, let the head of state be impeached, okay? This is his second term. He's got dwindling political capital as it is. He cannot run for re-election. Most heads of state, so we read, want to go down in history seen as having made a difference in her or his lifetime. Here we're calling for an act of statesmanship. Here we're talking for an act of leadership. Here we're talking about an act of moral conviction and commitment there, of living up to the best of America's ideals and liberating all three peoples there, not unlike Abraham Lincoln in the aftermath of a battle less than an hour's drive from here after Antietam and the emancipation of the slaves, a declaration of 1863. That was a game changer. It fundamentally changed the dynamics of something that up until that point seemed to have no end. This has never been done before. This would immediately take much of the wind out of the sails of Hamas, of Hezbollah, of Islamic Jihad, of the Muslim Brothers, of Iran, of Al-Qaeda. And it would be in accord with what is largely the entire rest of the world's wishes that the United States would take such a principled, courageous, effective stance, okay? With regard to retirees and hubris, yes. Hubris is a big part of it. And it may have happened anyway, but it certainly was given a boost or shot in the arm when the Cold War ended, because we could step back and be emotional and objective and say, my God, we won. Communism is dead. Capitalism and the free markets have won, and they've survived. And we have no challenger. This is the first time in America's history that this has ever been the case. And so we want to prolong the American century as best we can. But along with that good luck and good results came the perhaps inevitable degree of arrogance there. And arrogance doesn't wear well anywhere. If you're sitting next this evening to someone who's arrogant, I can understand if you'd like to move away there. So at the international level, it's abhorrent. It's vomit material. It really is, and unbecoming of a great power. As I said, we killed a country. We did it to a country that represented no threat to us, that we were the ones that were in violation of international law. And Iraq's population then was 24 million. Some 4 million, 1/6 were uprooted, 2 million became external refugees, 2 million displaced at home. That's 1/6 of Iraq's population. In American equivalency terms, that would be 55 million Americans made refugees as a result of an illegal invasion and occupation of the United States. And if that's not hubris, that we were right to do what we did, I don't know what is as such. With regard to Syria and Afghanistan, one can point fingers there as well in terms of hubris. The reason that there is no anti-other country to anywhere remotely the degree that there is to the United States. And by the way, France and Great Britain and Russia and China are great powers, but there is no anti-France, anti-Great Britain, anti-Russia, anti-China in this particular region. It is only anti-Americanism, and the hubris part has a lot to do with it, or hypocrisy, or double standards, or moral audacity, etc. With regard to the Arab winter or spring, or pick your seasons, they're having nothing to do with the Arab-Israeli conflict, you're absolutely right. It had to do with the reasons I tried to enumerate: despair, despondency, an inability. If you cannot bring home a paycheck, who the hell is going to marry you? Okay? How are you going to have access to affordable or even unaffordable housing there? Where's the dignity in this? Where's the decency in that? And so if we can project ourselves into those kinds of issues, I'd be angry as hell too. I'm not sure if I would be the first in front of the municipality, but I'd certainly be one of those that wanted to be and would give it serious and favorable consideration. Because I would have thought enough is enough is enough there. So you're right. But Egypt is in some ways a train that's left the station. Egypt, when power was defined primarily in terms of population, Egypt would have had it hands down because Egypt's population is pushing 90 million. That's 4 times the population of Iraq. That's 4 times the population of Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Oman combined. And yet Egypt's phone calls are not necessarily returned with a degree of rapidity, predictability, as was the case 50 years ago, because it's not just population anymore. Egypt has become an economic basket case there. But at the same time, it muddles through, as it has for 6,000 years. Egypt, in some ways, is a policeman's dream in direct opposition to Syria, in direct opposition to Iraq. Iraq was difficult enough. Syria about 10 times as difficult as Iraq. But Egypt, 96% of the population lives on 4% of the land. It would be as though in the United States, 96% of America's 315 million people lived on the banks of the Mississippi. We would not have the rights. We wouldn't have the freedoms. We wouldn't have the benefits, the privileges, the positions, the luxuries that we have. We're one of 6 remaining countries on the planet that still has lots of potential, lots of room to grow. We have not reached our limits. There are only 5 others like us. And for the hubris thing again, for us to think that, well, others should be like us, could be like us, if they just hustled, if they got their act together, I think that this is rather cruel on top of being ignorant and arrogant. It's like looking at a person in a wheelchair and say, look, goddammit, you can walk. It's all in your mind. You just got to put your will to it. There are inabilities of most other countries to have the green fields and the mountains and the valleys and the streams and the renewable resources and the vast open spaces that we still have. There are only 5 others like us there. So to try to make others over like ourselves, one, is not possible or probable, and 2, the effort and the sincerity behind the effort of people who think, just give us enough time and resources and we'll prevail, to me is arrogance and ignorance combined there. Other questions, please. Yes, sir. The question is, how can you have a two-state solution when you have a party like Hamas that today is saying that it would never recognize Israel, correct there? In the same way that we ended the Vietnam crisis, because the government of South Vietnam that we supported to the hilt never once, that the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese never once recognized the right of the government of South Vietnam to exist. Had we stood on that principle, we would still be there today. The 58,000 names engraved in the memorial on the Washington Mall would be multiplied ad infinitum many times more. The 1.3 Vietnamese that we killed in the process would be multiplied many times more. You don't make peace with your friends, you make peace with your enemies and your adversaries. We met with the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese for months on end in Paris until we came to a peaceful settlement of that particular conflict. All the others have been resolved that way too, including the fact that we stand here as free and independent people from October the 18th, 1781, and General John O'Hara and Alexander Hamilton in Yorktown, when the British finally agreed to talk with those who would not otherwise lay down their arms. That's what ended it, not insisting on this rhetorical formula and this rhetorical cascade of words. That's a distraction. It's an excuse for delay and for obfuscation. It just is like an old Southern dog that won't hunt anymore.
If you're disappointed that we're ending, I had the opportunity to read the other 5 titles which Dr. Anthony presented, and so I'm more disappointed than any of you. He's always interesting and wise, I believe, and not always in the mainstream, but always straightforward, and I think direct and to the point. It's been a marvelous evening. We thank you once again.